Welcome to the reading of the Sabbath School lesson for the second quarter of 2022. Welcome to lesson number 6 in the series on Genesis. It's titled The Roots of Abraham. It's ready for teaching on May 7, and I'm Percy Harrold. Wednesday, May 4, the Babel Coalition. Read Genesis chapter 14, verses 1 to 17. What is significant about this war taking place just after the gift of the promised land? What does this story teach us about Abram? Genesis 14, beginning at verse 1. Now war filled the land. Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasah, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, fought against Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shember, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, later called Zoar. These kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela mobilized their armies in Siddim Valley, that is, the Valley of the Dead Sea. For 12 years they had all been subject to King Chedorlaomer, but now in the 13th year they rebelled. 1 year later, Chedorlaomer and his allies arrived and the slaughter began, for they were victorious over the following tribes at the place indicated: the Rephaim at Ashtaroth-Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in the plain of Kiriathaim, the Horites in Mount Seir, as far as El-Paran at the edge of the desert. Then they swung around to En-Mishpat, later called Kadesh, and destroyed the Amalekites and also the Amorites living in Hazazon Tamar. But now the other army, that of the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, or Zoar, unsuccessfully attacked Chedorlaomer and his allies as they were in the Dead Sea Valley, 4 kings against 5. As it happened, the valley was full of asphalt pits, and as the army of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some slipped into the pits, and the remainder fled to the mountains. Then the victors plundered Sodom and Gomorrah, and carried off all their wealth and food, and went on their homeward way, taking with them Lot, Abram's nephew, who lived in Sodom, and all he owned. One of the men who escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was camping among the oaks belonging to Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and Aner, Abram's allies. When Abram learned that Lot had been captured, he called together the men born into his household, 318 of them all, and chased after the retiring army as far as Dan. He divided his men and attacked during the night from several directions, and pursued the fleeing army to Hobah, north of Damascus, and recovered everything: the loot that had been taken, his relative Lot, and all of Lot's possessions, including the women and other captives. As Abram returned from his strike against Chedorlaomer and the other kings at the valley of Shaveh, later called King's Valley, the king of Sodom came out to meet him. This is the first war narrated in the scriptures. As we read in verse 2, fought against Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinar, king of Admah, Shember, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, later called Zoar. The coalition of 4 armies from Mesopotamia and Persia against the other coalition of 5 Canaanite armies included the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, we read about that in verse 8, suggest a large conflict. The reason for this military operation has to do with the fact that the Canaanite peoples had rebelled against their Babylonian suzerains, as we read in verses 4 and 5. For 12 years they had all been subject to King Chedorlaomer, but now in the 13th year they rebelled. 1 year later Chedorlaomer and his tribes arrived, and the slaughter began, for they were victorious over the following tribes at the places indicated: the Rephaim at Ashtaroth-Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in the plain of Kiriathaim, the Horites in Mount Seir, as far as El-Paran at the edge of the desert. Although this story refers to a specific historical conflict, the timing of this global war, just after God's gift of the promised land to Abram, gives this event a particular spiritual significance. The involvement of so many peoples from the country of Canaan suggests that the issue at stake in this conflict was sovereignty over the land. Ironically, the camp of Abram, the truly interested party, because he is the only true owner of the land, is the only force that remains outside of the conflict, at least at first. The reason for Abram's neutrality is that for Abram, the promised land was not acquired through the force of arms or through the wisdom of political strategies. Abram's kingdom was God's gift. The only reason Abram will intervene is the fate of his nephew Lot, who was taken prisoner in the course of the battles, as we read in verses 12 and 13. Let's have another look at that. Taking with them Lot, Abram's nephew, who lived in Sodom, and all he owned. One of the men who escaped came and told Abram, the Hebrew, who was camping among the oaks belonging to Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and Aner, Abram's allies. In the book Patriarchs and Prophets, page 139, we read, Abraham, dwelling in peace in the oak groves at Mamre, learned from one of the fugitives the story of the battle and the calamity that had befallen his nephew. He had cherished no unkind memory of Lot's ingratitude. All his affection for him was awakened, and he determined that he should be rescued. Seeking first of all divine counsel, Abraham prepared for war. End of quote. But Abraham does not confront the whole coalition. In what must have been a quick and nocturnal commando operation, he attacks only the camp where Lot was held prisoner. Lot is saved. Thus this faithful man of God also showed great courage and fortitude. No doubt his influence in the region grew, and people saw the kind of man he was, and learned something more of the God whom he served. And so to finish today, what kind of influence do our actions have on others? What kind of message are we sending about our faith by our actions? This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind, and It Is Written. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. Remember, God is always faithful.